Viltrumites are the universe's ultimate instruments. They solve their problems with kinetic energy. If a mountain stands in their way, they fly right through it. If a civilization resists their rule, they crack the planet in half. They're built on one simple philosophy: superior strength conquers all. But what happens when kinetic energy swings at a target that doesn't exist? In the standard timeline, Mark Grayson inherits his father's alien DNA. He learns to throw a punch and take a beating. Today, we're taking the biology of a Viltrumite and fusing it with one of the most broken power systems in anime history. We're exploring an alternate timeline where Mark Grayson is born with Satoru Gojo's 6 eyes and the limitless technique. To understand this timeline, we have to start at the very beginning. When Mark is born, Nolan and Debbie immediately notice something different. Mark doesn't have his mother's brown eyes, nor does he have Nolan's. His eyes are crystalline blue. They look like two pieces of the summer sky trapped in a skull. At first, Nolan dismisses it as a strange human genetic quirk. He assumes human DNA is just flawed, but as Mark grows into a toddler, the problems start. Mark suffers from crippling headaches. He cries constantly, keeping his eyes squeezed shut. When Debbie takes him out into the sunlight, he screams. The doctors have no explanation. Nolan watches his son closely. He views the sunglasses and the headaches as a sign of weakness. Nolan is an advanced scout for an empire built on physical perfection, and he believes his son is defective. He doubts that Mark will ever develop Viltrumite powers, assuming the DNA diluted his strength. But Nolan couldn't be more wrong. Puberty hits, and everything changes. In the standard timeline, Mark's powers awaken while he's taking out the trash. He throws a garbage bag into the sky. In this timeline, the awakening is far more profound. Mark takes off his sunglasses one evening in his backyard. His Viltrumite biology spent 7 years building a neural foundation for this moment. For the first time, his brain fully comprehends the data the 6 eyes feed him. He sees the invisible tethers of gravity holding the world together. Viltrumites fly via a complex balancing system located in their inner ears. Mark realizes he can manipulate their equilibrium. He holds out his hand. He thinks about the space between his palm and the grass below. He activates the neutral state of the limitless technique, Infinity. A stray ball from the neighbor's yard flies over the fence, heading straight for Mark's head. Mark doesn't duck. Instead, he just watches the ball. As the ball gets closer to his face, it slows down. The distance between the ball and Mark's skin constantly halves. It halves again and again, ad infinitum. The ball loses all kinetic momentum and simply stops in midair, hovering an inch from his nose, suspended in an endless paradox. Mark realizes he's able to dictate the terms of reality. When he finally tells his parents about his powers, Nolan is thrilled. Nolan immediately takes Mark out for training. Nolan expects to teach his son how to throw a punch and how to absorb an impact. Nolan tells Mark to hit him. Mark steps forward, but he doesn't throw a standard punch. Mark applies curse technique Lapse Blue to his fist. He accidentally creates a localized point of attraction, a miniature vacuum in space, right in front of his knuckles. When Mark swings, the space around his fists implodes. The vacuum pulls Nolan forward, directly into the path of the strike. Mark's fist connects with Nolan's chest. The kinetic force of a Viltrumite punch combined with the spatial distortion of blue is devastating. Nolan expects a weak hit. Instead, the impact sends a shockwave through the clouds. Nolan is blasted backward, skidding across the dirt, clutching his ribs. He feels immense pain. Nolan looks up at his son, his eyes wide. Mark is standing still, his glowing blue eyes analyzing Nolan's physiological state. Nolan realizes in that exact moment that his son isn't defective. His son is something the Viltrumite Empire has never seen before. The true test of Mark's abilities comes during the Flaxan invasion. In the OG timeline, Mark struggles against the aging aliens. He takes hits, gets knocked around, and relies heavily on Omni-Man to bail him out. But in this timeline, Mark arrives on the scene wearing a blindfold. He realizes the sunglasses aren't enough to block out the noise of a full-scale battle, so he wraps a thick piece of dark fabric around his eyes. With the 6 eyes, he doesn't need to see normally. He perceives the energy signatures of every living thing in the city. The Flaxans march through their portal, firing concentrated laser cannons at the civilians. Mark drops directly into the middle of the street. A squad of Flaxan soldiers aims their rifles at him and open fires. Dozens of high-yield energy beams streak towards Mark, but as soon as they reach the invisible barrier of infinity, they stop. The lasers hit the paradox and dissipate harmlessly, their energy scattering into the air inches from his skin. The Flaxans freeze, confused. They fire again, throwing explosive charges and kinetic missiles. Everything stops. The shrapnel hangs in the air around Mark like a halo. Mark doesn't throw wild punches. He points a single finger at the largest Flaxan tank. Blue, Mark whispers. He creates a point of attraction inside the center of the tank. The heavy armor plates, the engine, and the soldiers inside are instantly and brutally crushed into a single sphere of metal. The tank implodes on itself, leaving nothing but a ball of scrap iron the size of a grapefruit. Nolan hovers above the city, watching his son work. Nolan is a seasoned warrior who has slaughtered entire planets. He understands war, but he doesn't understand this. Nolan watches Mark walk slowly through the battlefield, entirely untouched, crushing armored vehicles with a flick of his wrist. And a chilling realization creeps into Nolan's mind. His mission is to prepare Earth for Viltrumite rule. If Earth resists, he has to kill the defenders. But as he watches a laser stop midair around his son, and he asks himself a dark question. How do I kill something I cannot touch? High above the Earth, sitting in a secure office at the Global Defense Agency, Cecil Stedman watches the satellite footage of the Flaxan invasion. Cecil is a man who relies on contingency. He has a file on every single superhero on the planet. He knows Omni-Man is an alien, and he knows how hard a Viltrumite can hit. Cecil has spent billions of dollars developing weapons specifically designed to slow Omni-Man down if he ever goes rogue. But as Cecil watches Mark Grayson stand still, while a laser barrage harmlessly scatters around him, he feels a deep sense of dread. Run the footage back, Cecil Cecil orders his technicians, enhance the impact zone around the kid. The technicians slow down the footage to a fraction of a second. Cecil stares at the screen. He sees the laser beam moving towards Mark's chest. He sees the beam slow down, stretch, and eventually halt, hovering precisely 2 inches from the fabric of Mark's suit. It's an energy shield. One of the technicians suggests. No, Cecil mutters, leaning closer to the monitor. An energy shield absorbs impact. That beam didn't hit anything. It just ran out of space. Cecil is a pragmatist. He knows that he can hurt Omni-Man with enough heavy ordnance. If you drop a massive bomb on a Viltrumite, they still feel the heat and the shockwave. But Cecil realizes that traditional weapons are entirely useless against Mark. You can't drop a bomb on a target if that explosion can't physically reach their skin. Cecil tries to bring Mark in for testing. He invites him to the Pentagon, offering him a spot on the roster. During the meeting, Cecil subtly activates a specialized containment field in his office, a high-frequency energy grid designed to lock down a superhuman. Mark sits in Cecil's chair, fully aware of the grid the second it powers up. The six eyes read the energy output perfectly. You're wasting your electricity, Mr. Stedman, Mark says, smiling from beneath the blindfold. In this timeline, Mark is a lot stronger. He starts developing the same arrogance as Satoru Gojo. Mark casually stands up. He doesn't break the grid. He just manipulates the air around his body, stepping seamlessly through the containment field as if it was made of thin air. Cecil's jaw tightens. He realizes he has absolutely no leverage over Invincible. Mark is a walking anomaly, an entity that exists outside the boundaries of human science and alien biology alike. Cecil updates Invincible's threat level in the GDA database, moving him from a standard heavy hitter to an uncontainable asset. He closes the file, then he opens a new one. He titles it Weaknesses Unknown, and he starts filling it in. Now the narrative pivot approaches. In the OG story, Nolan realizes the Guardians of the Globe are a genuine threat to his takeover. He calls them to their headquarters and murders them, but in this timeline, Nolan's priorities are drastically altered. He still views the Guardians as a nuisance, but they're no longer his primary concern. His primary concern lives under his own roof. Nolan knows he has to launch his invasion soon. The Empire expects progress, and they've been waiting for almost 18 years. But he can't figure out how to bypass Mark's infinity. He spends weeks observing Mark, trying to find a single flaw. He watches Mark sleep, noticing that the infinity barrier remains active even when Mark is unconscious. Mark's brain has automated the process, filtering out threats automatically. Nolan realizes that killing the Guardians first would be a tactical error. If he murders them, it'll alert Mark, and if Mark turns against him, Nolan knows he's in deep trouble. Nolan decides to take a massive gamble. He decides to recruit Mark before attacking the Guardians. One evening, Nolan asks Mark to fly with him to the ruins of an abandoned city in the desert. The sun sets, casting long shadows over the cracked pavement. Nolan stands opposite his son, taking a deep breath. Mark, Nolan begins, his voice heavy. I haven't been entirely honest with you about Viltrum, about our purpose here. Nolan gives a speech. He explains the Viltrum Empire. He calls humans pets. He tells Mark that they are destined to rule the planet, to enforce order upon a chaotic world. He asks his son to stand by his side and help him conquer Earth. Mark listens quietly. The six eyes process his father's elevated heart rate, the subtle tension in his muscles, and the cold flow of his energy. In this timeline, Mark doesn't feel shocked. He feels a profound sense of disappointment. You want to enslave them, Mark says. I want to save them from themselves, Nolan counters, stepping forward. We don't owe these people anything. Mark shakes his head. I'm not doing it, Dad, and I'm not letting you do it either. The tension in the air snaps. Nolan's face hardens into a mask of pure rage. He expects defiance, but hearing it aloud triggers him. Then you leave me no choice, Nolan snarls. Nolan launches himself at Mark. He moves at Mach 10, aiming a brutal strike directly at Mark's heart. He intends to put his fist straight through his son's chest. The fight doesn't happen in Chicago. It happens right there in the desert, far away from innocent civilians. Mark deliberately chose to follow his dad out here because the Six Eyes told him Nolan was preparing for a fight. Nolan's fist breaks the sound barrier. The friction ignites the air around his knuckles. But just like the Flaxan lasers, Nolan's fist hits the infinity barrier. The impact is surreal. Nolan pushes with enough force to shatter a tectonic plate, but his fist just stops in midair, a few inches from Mark's chest. Nolan grunts, his veins bulging as he tries to force his arms forward. He feels like he's pushing against a solid wall. It's space, Dad, Mark says calmly. You're trying to cross an infinite distance. It doesn't matter how hard you push, you can't reach me. Nolan screams in frustration. He pulls his arms back and unleashes a flurry of punches. He moves so fast that his arms become a blur. He attacks from above, from below, and from behind. He tries to clap his hands together to create a massive sonic boom, hoping the pressure wave will rupture Mark's eardrums. Even if Nolan was fighting Gojo, he might have a chance. But in already invincible with Gojo's powers, it's too much. Mark uses his Viltrumite speed, combined with the spatial manipulation of Limitless. Mark raises a single finger. Curse technique reversal, red. A localized orb of repulsive energy manifests in front of Mark. The blast hits Nolan squarely in the chest. The force is catastrophic. Nolan is blasted backwards with double the kinetic energy he used to attack. He crashes through a series of abandoned skyscrapers, leveling 3 city blocks before coming to a halt in a cloud of dust. Nolan staggers to his feet, coughing up blood. His Viltrumite outfit is torn, and he's genuinely hurt. He looks up into the sky. Mark floats above him, his blindfold removed. Nolan tries a different tactic. He rips a massive chunk of bedrock out of the earth, a boulder the size of a stadium, and hurls it at Mark. Mark doesn't dodge. He holds out his hand and uses blue to pull the space around the boulder, shredding the rock into dust before it even reaches him. Nolan flies up, attempting attempting to grapple Mark, hoping to bypass the barrier by wrapping his arms around him. Mark lets him get close. As Nolan reaches out, Mark grabs his father's wrist. Because Mark initiated the contact, the barrier allows the touch. Mark squeezes his father's wrist with his own Viltrumite strength. "I don't want to kill you, Dad," Mark says, "but you can't beat me. You know you can't." Nolan looks into his son's glowing eyes. He sees absolute dominance. He sees the same confidence as Thrag. Viltrumite culture is built on the belief that the strongest rule. Nolan realizes, with a crushing sense of defeat, that he is no longer the strongest being on the planet. He's severely outmatched by his own offspring, and this psychological weight breaks Nolan faster than any physical punch could. The realization that his mission is an absolute failure, that he simply can't conquer this planet, shatters his resolve. Nolan tears his arms away from Mark's grip. He doesn't say another word. He turns his back on Earth, shoots up into the atmosphere, and flies into the depths of deep space. There's no thousands of dead civilians in Chicago. There's no subway train massacre. Mark controls the battlefield entirely, preventing any collateral damage. The world remains safe, and Omni-Man retreats in disgrace. But in the silence that follows, Mark doesn't know that somewhere across the multiverse, someone has been watching the whole thing, and he is not impressed. News of Omni-Man's sudden departure confuses the world, but Cecil Stedman quickly capitalizes on it. He makes Mark the official protector of Earth. The Guardians of the Globe remain alive, serving as a secondary defense force while Mark handles global threats effortlessly. For a while, it feels almost manageable. 7 billion people go about their lives with no idea how close they came to losing everything, and no idea how much closer they're about to get, because the multiverse still exists, and Angstrom Levy still holds his grudge. In this timeline, Levy's hatred for Mark stems from a different incident. During a multiversal rescue operation, Mark uses blue to collapse a portal, accidentally trapping a version of Levy. Levy vows revenge, gathering evil variants of Mark from across the multiverse to ruin his reputation. Levi brings the evil Invincible variants to Earth. He expects them to slaughter the planet and humiliate Mark. The evil variants arrive in New York City. They're brutal and accustomed to using their Viltrumite strength to crush opposition. Mark arrives on the scene, floating above the city. He looks at the dozen evil versions of himself. One of the evil variants, wearing a dark cape, laughs. "Look at this guy! He's wearing a blindfold! Let's tear his head off." The evil variants rush Mark all at once. They attack from every conceivable angle, moving at supersonic speeds. Mark doesn't even move his hands. He just expands his infinity barrier slightly. A dozen Viltrumites crash into the barrier simultaneously. They pile up against the invisible war, their fists stopping inches from Mark's face. They push, they scream, and they struggle, completely baffled by the resistance. Mark sighs. "You guys really lack imagination." Mark points his fingers. He decides he doesn't have time to fight 18 brawlers individually. He decides to use his ultimate technique. He combines the attractive force of blue and the repulsive force of red. "Hollow technique purple," Mark says calmly. A devastating orb of imaginary mass materializes in the air. It erases matter entirely. Mark fires the purple blast directly through the cluster of evil variants. The blast tears a hole through reality. 6 of the evil variants are caught in the direct path. They simply cease to exist. Their dense Viltrumite bodies, capable of surviving planetary explosions, are instantly deleted from the universe. The remaining evil variants freeze in horror. They watch a third of their team vanish into thin air. Their Viltrumite arrogance evaporates instantly, replaced by sheer panic. They have never encountered anything that can bypass their durability so effortlessly. Levy, watching from a portal, realizes that his plan is a catastrophic failure. He tries to close the portals and flee. Mark sees Levy retreating. Mark uses blue to instantly pull himself across the city, breaking the sound barrier without creating a sonic boom. He grabs Levy by the collar before the portal can close, shutting down the multiversal threat in a matter of minutes. In his office in the GDA, Cecil watches the purple blast erase 6 Viltrumites from existence. He doesn't react with relief. He leans forward in his chair, watching the footage loop back. "He erased them," one of the technicians says. Cecil doesn't answer. He's already thinking about who else might have seen this feed. He pulls up a separate monitor and starts scanning for deep space transmissions, because Cecil Stedman knows that when something this powerful goes on the record, the wrong audience is always watching. The Viltrumite Empire doesn't tolerate failure, nor do they ignore anomalies. When Nolan returns to the Empire and reports that his son possesses an impenetrable defense and reality-bending offense, the Grand Regent takes notice. He sends his most brutal executioner. Conquest loves war. He loves breaking things. He doesn't care about strategy or nuance. He believes that if you hit something hard enough, it will eventually break. So when he arrives on Earth, he demands Mark's immediate surrender. Mark meets Conquest over the Atlantic Ocean, keeping the fight far away from populated areas, far away from the coastlines, the cities, the 7 billion people who have no idea this fight is happening. Conquest smiles. "Your father said you had a magic shield, boy. I'm going to shatter it, and then I'm going to shatter you." Conquest attacks with relentless savagery. He hits the infinity barrier with strikes that could crack the moon. He doesn't stop. He throws hundreds of punches. Mark watches Conquest exhaust himself against the barrier. The older Viltrumite's knuckles begin to bleed from the sheer force he's exerting. "Are you done?" Mark asks politely. Conquest roars. Mark drops his infinity barrier for a fraction of a second. He steps inside Conquest's guard, using his own Viltrumite speed. Mark aims at a bare-knuckle punch directly at Conquest's liver. The punch connects. The space around Conquest's torso warps. The kinetic force is multiplied exponentially. Conquest's dense ribcage shatters instantly. He coughs up a massive spray of blood. The unbreakable warrior is brought to his knees by a single strike. You relied too much on your biology, Mark says, looking down. You never bothered to learn how physics actually works. Conquest's body was broken, but the Six Eyes were still reading his bioelectrical signature, and the signal was still hot. His fighting instinct was still completely online. Mark did not have time for that. Mark uses blue to grab Conquest's arm. The spatial vacuum grips the arm tightly. Mark plants his foot on Conquest's chest and pulls. With a sickening crunch, Mark rips a mechanical arm cleanly off Conquest's shoulder. He screams in agony. His fighting spirit finally breaks. He tries to flee, flying upward towards the atmosphere. Mark raises his hand, forms a smaller hollow purple, and fires it. The blast clips Conquest's legs, erasing them entirely from the knees down. Conquest plummets into the ocean, alive but permanently crippled and defeated. Back at the GDA, Cecil watches the arm come off on the satellite feed. He pulls up his weaknesses unknown file and adds one single line. Output is devastating, but his barrier dropped to throw the punch. Duration of exposure, 0.3 seconds. He underlines it twice. While Mark appears untouchable, the combination of Viltrumite biology and the Six Eyes is not without its flaws. See, the Six Eyes requires immense brain processing power. Even with Viltrumite smart atoms constantly repairing his neural pathways, the mental fatigue is a real issue. Mark doesn't have an infinite well of cursed energy like Gojo, and he powers the limitless during his own bioelectrical energy. When Mark uses complex techniques like hollow purple or rapid successions of blue and red, it drains his physical stamina heavily. He simply can't spam his moves without feeling the physical toll, and his smart atoms from his Viltrumite biology require calories and rest to rebuild the burned out pathways. Furthermore, Infinity does not filter out things that are necessary for survival. Mark still needs to breathe. He still needs oxygen. Cecil Stedman has been building to this conclusion since the Flaxan footage. He walks his team through it methodically, like a man delivering a verdict he doesn't enjoy. You cannot punch him. You cannot contain him. You cannot even get a weapon close enough to his skin to matter. Cecil pauses, but he still breathes. And Infinity doesn't filter out asphyxiation, because a lack of air isn't an attack. It's just the absence of something he needs. If an enemy destroys the atmosphere or traps Mark in a deep vacuum for an extended period, the barrier won't save him from suffocating. Mark knows this weakness too. He spends hours training to hold his breath longer, pushing his Viltrumite lung capacity to its absolute max. He learns to use blue to quickly gather dense pockets of oxygen around his head if he's ever forced into space for more than 2 weeks. But Cecil's file isn't classified, not everywhere, and somewhere across the galaxy, a grand region has been paying very close attention. Thrag isn't a mindless brawler like Conquest. Thrag is a tactical genius, the absolute pinnacle of Viltrumite evolution, and he understands warfare better than anyone in the galaxy. When Thrag reviews the orbital footage of Conquest's humiliating defeat, he doesn't react with anger. He studies the data. He watches a playback of Mark bending space. He watches a purple blast delete 6 Viltrumites from the universe. He watches the 0.3 seconds of the barrier drop. Thrag immediately identifies the flaw. He realizes he can't punch through the spatial barrier, but he knows the boy still relies on human-adjacent biology to survive. Mark needs to breathe, and more importantly, Mark cares about the fragile planet he protects. Thrag doesn't send a lone assassin this time. He brings a full, overwhelming might of the Viltrumite armada to the Earth's orbit. Hundreds of massive, heavily armored dreadnoughts drop out of warp space, blotting out the stars. He doesn't send his soldiers down to the surface for a ground war. He orders his ships to form a blockade and target Earth's atmosphere. He plans to ignite the ozone layer, burning the oxygen right off the planet. He wants to suffocate humanity and force Mark to fight in the cold vacuum of space, where his stamina and breath will eventually run dry. Down on Earth, the sky turns a burning crimson as the fleet's orbital lasers begin heating the upper atmosphere. Mark doesn't waste time debating tactics with Cecil Stedman. He leaves the Guardians of the Globe on the surface to handle the falling debris, manage the panicked civilians, and put out the fires. And the fires are already reaching the suburbs. Cecil's monitor shows something scary. Atmospheric oxygen levels are dropping in the upper stratosphere. At the current rate, Earth is only going to have a breathable surface for 40 minutes. Mark flies up into orbit to face the Armada alone. Thrag stands on the hull of his massive flagship, wearing his white royal cape. He looks at the teenager floating in the endless void of space, surrounded by hundreds of warships. You hold a neat parlor trick, boy. Thrag telepathically broadcasts to Mark, but a trick cannot save a planet from fire. Surrender the world, or watch them all choke. The Armada opens fire. Hundreds of plasma cannons rain destruction down towards Earth. Mark doesn't hesitate. He takes one deep breath, knowing his oxygen supply is on a strict timer. He activates blue, creating a gravitational pull directly beyond the enemy fleet, and slingshots himself forward at speeds far exceeding light. He becomes a streak of blue energy, tearing through the dark void. Mark targets some massive warships directly. Using his infinity barrier to act as an indestructible drill, he carves through the reinforced hulls of the Viltrumite cruisers. He tears through engine blocks, shatters their primary cannons, and leaves dozens of dreadnoughts drifting as dead metal in a matter of seconds. The Viltrumite soldiers inside are sucked out into the void, helpless against a target they can't even touch. Thrag watches as his invincible Viltrumite fleet gets dismantled by a single individual. The Grand Regent decides to intervene personally. Thrag intercepts Mark in the vacuum. He times it perfectly, catching Mark in the exact second the boy drops his barrier to conserve his rapidly draining stamina for an offensive strike. Thrag grabs Mark's arm. The grip is like a vice made of collapsed stars. The grip is extremely tight. Thrag squeezes, his fingers digging into Mark's suit, intending to rip the arm clean off off the shoulder and bleed him out in the vacuum. Mark's lungs were already burning. He had maybe 90 seconds of breath left. He winces, but he doesn't thrash around. He doesn't panic. He looks at Thrag, his glowing blue eyes staring deeply into the Grand Regent's soul. "You're strong. My dad talked about you. You must be Thrag," Mark says, through the localized comms built into his suit, "but you're standing way too close." Mark uses red at point-blank range, firing the repulsive orb directly against Thrag's chest. The repulsive force in the vacuum of space is monumental. With no air resistance or gravity to slow him down, Thrag is blasted backwards. He crashes through the debris of his own ruined warships. The sheer kinetic impact shatters Thrag's royal armor and damages his spine. Thrag floats into the wreckage, coughing up blood in the vacuum. He realizes he miscalculated the situation entirely. He assumed his pure physical superiority would eventually overwhelm the boy's stamina. What he didn't account for was the destructive output of the limitless technique. Mark floats above the ruined ship. He's exhausted, and his head pounds with the massive migraine from overusing the Six Eyes. His lungs ache desperate for oxygen, but he holds his hands up, forming a bright sphere of hollow purple. It grows to the size of a small moon. He aims it directly at Thrag's flagship. Thrag sees the purple light. His survival instincts finally override his pride. He issues an immediate retreat. The remaining Viltrumite ships activate their warp drives, fleeing the solar system as fast as their engines can carry them. Mark lowers his hand, dissolving the purple orb to save his remaining energy. He uses blue to pull himself backwards into Earth's gravity well. He drops through the atmosphere and collapses onto the grass outside the GDA headquarters, gasping for fresh air. He won! The Viltrumite Empire was broken by a single teenager. The fusion of Viltrumite biology and the Six Eyes creates a paradox that entirely breaks the power scaling of the Invincible universe. In a world where conflicts are resolved by who hits the hardest, Mark Grayson introduces a power system based on infinity and spatial distortion. He doesn't have to sacrifice his body or endure the brutal beatings that define the original timeline. But this timeline also proves that power carries a heavy physical tax. The Six Eyes demand a relentless toll on Mark's bioenergy. His battles are no longer tests on physical endurance, but they're more tests of mental endurance. He has to manage his oxygen, his migraines, and his energy reserves carefully. He wins every fight, but he wins them on a timer. Mark Grayson didn't win by being the strongest. He won by making strength irrelevant. And every Viltrumite in the galaxy who survived their encounter is still trying to figure out what to do with that.